Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Genesis chapter 47. We are calling this one Jacob in Egypt. We're going to have a few different events in this chapter. First, we'll start with Joseph bringing his brothers and his father before Pharaoh, and then Jacob and Pharaoh will have this very brief exchange, and something interesting is going to happen twice, actually, in this short meeting. Then the Egyptians, we're going to see they're out of food and they have no money, so they're going to come to Joseph, and they're going to have to resort to bartering. But through it all, we're going to see that Joseph is providing for his family. Then there's an abrupt scene shift between verses 27 and 28. All of a sudden, we fast forwarded 17 years in the future, and now Jacob is preparing to pass on, and he's sort of getting his affairs in order. Really, the rest of the book of Genesis is largely going to be about these preparations of Jacob, the last of the three patriarchs getting ready to pass on. Acts 17:11 reminds us to be Bereans. Study the word with great eagerness, receive the word with great eagerness, but study and examine the scriptures daily. Don't take anyone's word for it, but do your own homework. Genesis 47, verse 1. Then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. We have to remember that the last few chapters have all happened in successive order. So we had they came back to buy more grain, the brothers did. They had a great banquet with Joseph, and we had the Egyptians sitting by themselves, and Joseph sitting by himself, and the brothers sitting by themselves. And they're all making merry, and then they get ready to go back, and lo and behold, Benjamin has the silver cup in his bag, and they all get perp walked back to Egypt. And Judah steps up as the leader, letting Joseph know that things have really changed. Judah's not the same person. Joseph then breaks down, reveals who he is, asks about Jacob, and then with Pharaoh's blessing and Pharaoh's equipment, they went back up to Canaan to get Jacob and the rest of their family. And then last chapter, we looked at the lists of everyone who had come down to Egypt. So all of this is still happening in the same sequence when we have Joseph here going before Pharaoh and introducing Jacob to him. So again, the number 5 is appearing throughout this whole episode with Joseph. 5 garments given to Benjamin, 5 meal portions given to Benjamin. When all this began, there were 5 years of famine remaining when he summoned his family to Egypt. He's taking 1/5 of the portion for taxes. We're going to see that referenced a couple times in this chapter. So 5, as we mentioned, generally speaks of grace and favor. So the thinking here is that Joseph is choosing 5 brothers, and it's interesting we aren't told who they are, but all of this is to get Pharaoh's favor and grace upon Joseph's family. So that's one of the reasons we see the number 5. And if we remember the lists of names in the last chapter, there are a lot of people here. These don't necessarily have to be his immediate brothers. They could have been 5 men from among his extended family. We just aren't told. So again, we have the land of Goshen, and that is in what we would say is the northeast part of Egypt, the part towards the Mediterranean Sea in the Nile Delta. And so it was great land for herding, and also they were separated from other Egyptians, which might have been one of the reasons for a exchange we're about to see in the next verse. So presumably the Egyptians were immoral and idolatrous, and the Israelites would have been separated from that. And so this worked out well, having them in their own area, until, as we begin the book of Exodus, the Israelites became so big that they couldn't be ignored. Verse 3, Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, What is your occupation? So they said to Pharaoh, Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. They also said to Pharaoh, We have come to reside in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. So Pharaoh gives his stamp of approval here. And remember that the end of chapter 46 Joseph told his brothers, when Pharaoh calls and says, what do you do for a living? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock since our youth, because every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So they answer here, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. Presumably, Joseph has them say they are keepers of livestock, which would include sheep and goats. So again, to keep them separate from the Egyptian, and it appears that strategy worked out because they're in the land of Goshen. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my living abroad are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years that my father lived during the days of their living abroad. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. A very curious exchange here. Pharaoh basically just wants to know, how old are you? Which is interesting, right? That's what he zeroes in on. Apparently, from this, scholars gather that Jacob must have appeared really old. And Jacob's answer is, it ain't the years, it's the mileage. The consequences of his numerous poor decisions have wore heavily on Jacob, and he's very weathered and very old and tired. He answers, the years of my sojourning are 130. So Pharaoh just wanted a numerical answer, but Jacob tells the quality of my years have just not been good. He felt like he never really had a home, and he talks about being few and unpleasant, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The writer to the Hebrews, though, picks up on this, and this thought that they were never really content because they weren't home. They were in the promised land, but they hadn't received all of the terms of the promise. Hebrews 11:13, that's the famous Hall of Faith chapter. All these, talking about the patriarchs, died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen and welcomed them from a distance, having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. That's the writer to Hebrews in chapter 11. We'll come back to this thought that did the patriarchs have any sense of the afterlife as they were living? There's a very interesting passage in another book that we'll talk about at the end of our study. Most of us don't see 130 as being old, but we have to remember that Abraham lived to 175, Jacob lived to 180, and we're going to see that Isaac lived to 180, Jacob died at 147. It's going to be 17 years later, so he's 130 now. He's going to be 147 when he passes. That is 180 minus 33. And the sages would say that Abraham should have lived to 180, but he was penalized 5 years for the time he spent in unbelief in Egypt. That's a tradition. But in either case, to Jacob, he sees his life as being cut short. And the sages actually chastised Jacob for this response right here. He had a job to bear witness to God in front of Pharaoh, but he doesn't do that. He has this glass half empty response of self-pity. And the sages point out all of the numerous times that God saved Jacob from himself more than anyone else, delivering him from Esau and Laban. He saved his family through the famine, even prospering him. He returned not only Joseph, but Dinah, Simeon, and Benjamin. When we thought they were lost, they've all been returned. And so he really gets the back of the hand from the sages for this response. He blew his witness, is a term we might say. There are 33 words in Hebrew in Jacob's lament in this passage right here. And the sages draw a connection to the fact that he was supposed to live to 180, just like his father Isaac lived. But 180 minus 33 is 147. And they see a connection between the 33 words in this passage to the fact that his life was shortened by that exact same number. So the sages would envision God as saying, look, I did all this for you, and yet you complain about your life. I will take then these 33 words that you spoke about how bad your life was, and I will deduct them from your total years. So then your years will indeed not reach those of your fathers. Now, this is not in the Bible, it's tradition, but I think it's interesting, and the story is a great reminder to for all of us to live a life of gratitude and have a glass half full outlook. And I got the privilege to teach at Celebrate Recovery just last night, and the theme was gratitude and how we should start every day thanking God for his gifts to us, thanking God for our friends around us, and for our church family and all the work that he's doing in us. So always have an attitude of gratitude. So we see twice that Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and wouldn't we expect the other way around, right? Pharaoh should be the one blessing Jacob. Pharaoh's the king. But this is a fulfillment, really, of Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curses you I will curse, and in you all of the families of the earth will be blessed. So while Egypt was blessing the family of Abraham, then they received the blessing. When in Exodus chapter 1, we're going to see a Pharaoh arise who knew not Joseph, they're going to begin to curse that family, and then bad things start happening. Now Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them property in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their little ones. So Joseph is still providing for his family, which is a picture of Jesus. But first, this land of Ramesses, it puzzles scholars because Ramesses wasn't on the scene until about the 13th century or so, and this is probably taking place in the 17th or 18th century BC. So in Exodus 1:11, it also says the storehouses of Pithom and Ramesses were said to be constructed by the Hebrew slaves. That's one of the things they worked on. So again, Pharaoh Ramesses II was in the 13th century. And so it's sort of like what we saw in Genesis 21, where they referred to the low-lying coastal region as the land of the Philistines, even though there was no such thing as the Philistines in that time. So they're being anachronistic here, but they're making it known to their audience that this is that land. That land that we talk about, the Philistines, yeah, that's where they were. And again, we see Joseph also provided. Jesus is our great provider. Matthew 6:33, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. All these things will be provided to you. Hebrews 11:40, because God has provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So Jesus is providing us for us, and God is providing for us. Now there was no food in all the land because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt, the land of Canaan, languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in payment for grain in which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. We're going to find that when it says all the money, he collected all the money. There was none left, and we'll get to that in a minute. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph saying, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." Then Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he fed them with food in exchange for their livestock all year. Remember, when his family came, there were still 5 more years of famine remaining. So we don't know how long this is, how much time has elapsed. But certainly when the family came down, there were still 5 years of rough patches ahead. So in these first couple of years, the people had spent all their money on grain, and now they're down to trading whatever they have left, which is their livestock and whatnot in their property. So bartering, when there's no money, bartering is all you got. And a lot of people say, watch the dollar. It's not looking real healthy right now. So if there's anything you can store up to barter instead of the greenbacks, you may want to think about doing that. They may have physically traded horses to Joseph, meaning Joseph took possession of the horses, but more likely this is probably what we might say the equivalent of a car title loan. They signed over ownership of the animals to Joseph, but they still got to keep them and got to use them. And this actually makes more sense. What is Joseph going to do with every horse in the land of Egypt, right? And then it becomes his problem to feed and take care of them. If he leaves them with the person, but he's retaining title, feeding and caring for the animals would be the previous owner's responsibility and not Joseph. So probably that's what happened. What's happening here. But when that year ended, so another year's gone by, and they've traded all their horses and whatever for food, they came to him the next year and said, "We will not hide from my lord the fact that all our money is spent, and the livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both us and our land? Buy us," so they're selling themselves into slavery just so they can survive, "and our land for food, and we and ourselves and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. So with nothing left to barter, they must now sell their land and sell their persons, and become tenant farmers. And I'll resist the urge to draw comparisons to our day about how we have to pay an annual tribute to our lords for the privilege of using what we think is our own land. And what happens if you don't pay the tribute? Then, well, the lords will come and kick you off your land and take possession. And it's darned if you do, darned if you don't, because if you do pay, then your tribute goes to fund special indoctrination centers that turn your children against you. So, okay, I guess I didn't resist the urge to talk about property taxes, but it's the same thought, right? The government has this entrenching control in our lives. At least the Egyptians were getting some, food in exchange for giving up their land. I'm not exactly sure what we're getting in response, but I'll move on. As for the people, he relocated them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the others. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, because the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. So this little aside is interesting from the perspective of having the professional clergy set apart. And this is certainly a model that God used when he said the Levites would not inherit because their inheritance is the Lord's. Joshua 18:7. The Levites have no portion among you because the priesthood of the Lord is their inheritance. So there's definitely scriptural support for elevating our pastors and our full-time ministers, supporting them, setting them apart, and giving them additional benefits. So that goes way back in the book of Genesis. Joseph said to the people, "Behold, today I have purchased you and your land for Pharaoh. Here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. At the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own." So this is really a pretty good deal, given that they've just signed everything over to eat. He's going to let them keep the proceeds, basically, minus a 20% tribute. For the seed of the field and for your food, for your households, your food, and your love. Right? They got all these animals that are Joseph's, right? He wants them fed and he wants them taken care of. So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves." So again, Joseph is formalizing this Lord-tenant agreement. And again, would that we only paid 20% tribute in everything and got to keep the other 80%. It's not quite how it works in our day. These types of treaties are very common in the ancient world, and it's something, as you're reading, especially the Torah, to be on the lookout for these. The entire book of Deuteronomy is this kind of treaty, where the terms are read publicly, and then the people answer something to the effect of, "All that you have said," or in the Israelites' case, "all the Lord has said we will do." The giving of the law at Sinai is another example of this. So Moses is reading the terms of the contract, and the people will agree to abide by them. Now, Egypt will later get in this business of providing such services for nations, and so perhaps we see a model here. In the ancient world, this is known as a suzerain vassal treaty, Suzerain, and then vassal is the subject. So the suzerain is the big boss, and then the vassal is the subject. So Egypt, in this case, so look where Canaan is, right? It's right in between. If you're going from Egypt to Assyria, you have to go through Egypt. And so it's called the crossroads of history. It's called the land between, because all throughout the ancient times, this land was being trampled over by the big boys, right? Egypt and Assyria and Babylon. So Egypt, what they would do was, as they're marching through, they would offer protection and provisions to a smaller country such as Israel or Judah in exchange, again, for tribute and the promise of loyalty. And we'll let you live, but you have to pay us a little fee. Because we're going to take care of you now. And then eventually, so if you see Assyria up on the upper right on the map here, then they would come in and they would move in and they'd try to do the same thing. They're basically, two thugs demanding the same kid's lunch money, right? So then Israel would say, well, we already gave to Egypt, we gave at the office. And then Assyria would essentially say, well, I'll tell you what, you pay me instead of paying Egypt. Now, in exchange, I'll take care of you. I won't burn your city and I won't ravage your women. And if Egypt gives you any trouble, I'll protect you from them. And then Assyria leaves, and then Egypt comes back and says, where's our money? And they say, hey, we gave at the office, we gave to Assyria. And then Egypt will say, hey, I thought we had an understanding. Let me explain it to you a little more clearly, right? I'll tell you what we'll do for you. And, so it went for these small nations. It was really, a rough time to be a small country, because you can see that it's a protection racket, basically. And so this concept of a protection racket goes way back. Give me your money and I'll make sure we take care of you. We really see this after the time of Solomon. So as we get into the books of Kings and Chronicles, as you're reading this, realize this dynamic between Egypt and Assyria, and then eventually Babylon, with Israel and Judah, the small players caught in the middle. And it's this undercurrent that really goes through the entire period of the Davidic monarchy. So I had to kind of chuckle when I read the story of Joseph, basically saying, I'll protect you, just sign everything over to me. Joseph's being very shrewd here. But they say, so you have saved our lives. And so Joseph, again, is the Savior. The Lancaster writes, the Messiah inspires the Gentile world to attach themselves to the Savior, in this case, the God of the Jews. Joseph made a statute concerning the land of Egypt valid to this day, meaning when this was written, it was some years later and it was still in place. Pharaoh was to have the fifth, only the land of the priests did not become pharaohs. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt and Goshen. They acquired property in it and were faithful and became very numerous. Now we have this transition and we move into verse 28. And it's interesting that in the Hebrew reckoning, they divide the last passage of Genesis. They really start it here. So this could have been a chapter break here. We'll see that 17 years have passed since the other events. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. So when we talked about when he was 130, he was talking to Pharaoh, and now it's 17 years later. When the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, please, if I have found favor in your sight, place your hand under my thigh now and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. But when I lie down with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And Joseph said, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. And the next couple of chapters are going to be Jacob blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, and then chapter 49 is going to be his blessing / prophecy over the 12 tribes, and that's an absolutely fascinating chapter. So they swore upon the sign of the covenant, and it sounds weird, the whole thigh thing, but just as we do today, we swear on the Bible, which is the sign of our covenant. That's what they did back then. No judgment, right? But ancient burial locations, so such as Abraham's cave in Hebron, called the Cave of Machpelah, that is what would serve to tie the generations together. So he wanted to be buried there. If you think back to the beginning of the story, remember how old Joseph was when he had his first dream that got him into all that trouble. He was 17 years old, and now 17 years later, it's the end of Joseph's life. The end of Jacob's life. So book ended by events that happened divided by 17 years. So the continuity is really staggering here. To the sages, kindly and truly, or in kindness and faithfulness, means we do something for others, and when we do that, we do it for their benefit, not ours. So we don't do things for what we might gain. Pliskin writes, true kindness is when you help someone without any ulterior motive. And the word in Hebrew for this is chesed v'emet. loving kindness and truth. And there's a whole side study in that phrase that is fascinating to undertake. But so true kindness is when you help someone without any ulterior motive. So our kind of walking in the dust thought is we put others first. When someone asks us to do something, we should do it with kindness and in truth. Philippians 2, 3, and 4, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility, consider one another more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. John refers to both the Father and the Son as grace and truth. In Hebrew, it would be this phrase, chesed v'emet. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. As we saw his glory, glory of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. And then in verse 17 of John 1, grace and truth came or were realized through Jesus Christ. So we see this model again of Joseph being the true, kind, and faithful servant. This is a little tangent maybe to end the study here. When Jacob says, I lie down with my fathers, we don't really know what their concept of the afterlife was. God gradually introduces the afterlife, or heaven as we come to call it, as the story of the Bible unfolds. And so by the time of Jesus, we know that heaven is a place that perhaps is more real than our world is today. If you have studied anything about quantum physics, that basically says our world is mostly an empty space and a simulation. But when they say gather to their fathers, to them perhaps it was enough. Physically, put my bones in with Abraham and Isaac's, and then I'll be good. But many people consider the book of Job to be the oldest chronologically written first book. So it really would be the first book of the Bible. It's the oldest book. And there's a curious hint here of the afterlife. Before God tested Job, look at these numbers here. Job 1:3. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. The man was blameless, upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. Then look at the math. 7 sons, 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, many male servants. The man was the greatest of all the men of the East. So you probably know the story. God permits the devil to test Job to see whether he remains faithful. Basically, Satan issues a challenge. So he's only worshiping you because you protect him. So stop protecting him and let's see what happens. The testing itself actually comes and goes pretty quickly. He loses everything. He's left with only his life, and not a very good one at that, because he's full of sores and he's just in a bad state. And the bulk of the book involves basically Hebrew poetry, these long discourses between Job and his 3 friends, all trying to come up with some explanation for what happened. Finally, at the end of the book, God has to step in and basically says, I'm sovereign. What happens because I will it, and that's good enough for you. But ultimately, Job passes the test. And then God says he's going to restore Job double everything he's lost. So keep an eye on this math. 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000, 3,000, 500, 500. Skip to the end of the book, and we see that after his restoration, the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. So you notice that all the animals are doubled. But if God doubled everything, shouldn't there be 14 sons and 6 daughters? And so the thought here, and I got this from Chuck Missler, is that the initial 7 and 3 didn't really die. They departed from this life and then advanced into some reality beyond this earth. And remember, we presume the story of Job would have been known to the patriarchs. And that knowing what we now know about Jesus' teaching today on heaven, we would say, indeed, Job was doubled, because in heaven, Job has a total of 14 sons and a total of 6 daughters, exactly double. What he had before his test, the 7 and 3, he never really lost. They just went ahead of him. So I found this interesting in the thought of the patriarchs. They all faced death pretty well. They knew their end was coming. They got their affairs in order. They pronounced blessings, and they all faced it with grace that it was hard to imagine, right? If you think this is the end, you don't want to let go. But perhaps they knew it wasn't the end, really. And so I thought that was interesting. We can maybe discuss that during our discussion time. So next time we'll look at the relatively short chapter 48 that deals with Jacob's blessing on Ephraim and Manasseh, and then that will kind of lead into the big prophecy over the 12 tribes, and then we'll wrap it up in chapter 50 with the final days of Joseph. So we'll see you next time for Genesis chapter 48.